Tonight in our series, next week I'll begin with next. Next week Rabbi Feinstein is going to be speaking about Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, one of Rabbi Feinstein's teachers. Tonight we're going to study my teacher, Rabbi Dr. Neil Gilman. Someone we don't talk a lot about here, but his work has really influenced me and my religious understanding of Judaism and modernity. Let me tell you a couple of stories to begin with. Rabbi Neil Gilman was a professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary where I was ordained. Rabbi Feinstein was ordained. Rabbi Feinstein and I share a love for Rabbi Gilman. In fact, both of us have similar pictures of Rabbi Gilman hanging in our offices because Rabbi Gilman was also Rabbi Feinstein's teacher, and then he became my teacher. When I was at JTS, I was very involved in the philosophy department. I was actually supposed to get a PhD in philosophy and decided I'd rather be with people than with books, so I ended up not doing that. But I was Rabbi Gilman's TA for about 5 years at the seminary, so I was very close with him. Rabbi Gilman comes from Canada. We don't hold that against him. But he comes from Canada. He ended up coming to the Jewish Theological Seminary as a graduate student. He had finished his doctorate, and he was now as a professor in residence at the seminary. And he was the heir to Abraham Joshua Heschel and to Mordechai Kaplan and their work at JTS. So he comes from both of those places. He comes from the world of the phenomenal experience, which is Heschel's theology, the experience of religion, the experience of God, the pathos that one feels when you look at the works of the prophets. And he comes from the pragmatic school when you're looking at Kaplan's work and the understanding of community. So he has come from both of those things together. And he actually, Rabbi Gilman, sits in the same office that Rabbi Heschel sat in and has the same desk that Rabbi Heschel had at the seminary. Now, for those of you who have ever been there, know that Rabbi Gilman's impression on the seminary has been monumental. He has written many, many books. He has lectured many, many students. He has taught many, many students. He has traveled the country, and when he was younger, when he could, teaching people around the country about Jewish theology and the importance of Jewish theology. And he was known iconically for smoking a beautiful pipe. And you always knew when he was in residence at the seminary because you would walk down the hallway and you would smell his pipe and his pipe smoke. So Rabbi Gilman now is older. He's almost the same age as Rabbi Schulweis was. He's a couple years younger. He's retired, but I still stay in touch with him. And again, as I said before, his thoughts and feelings about Judaism has deeply influenced me, and I think are still really important for us to think about today. So tonight we'll be going through some of his works, both inside. I'll be teaching some of his works. We're going to talk a little bit about some major topics that he touches on the God that he knows, and I'll talk a little bit about how his theology has influenced me and things I think about as I approach Judaism and sort of weave together some of the threads of his thoughts, Heschel's thoughts, Schulweis's thoughts, etc. So we're going to go on this little adventure. Where Rabbi Gilman, Dr. Gilman, begins his conversation is with the human experience. This is where Heschel also begins his conversation. He asks a simple question. How do you know that anything that you experience in the world is really happening? What verification model do you have to know that how you're experiencing whatever that phenomenon is truly happening? That's his first question. It's not a theological question, but it has huge theological implications. Now, we have ways of explaining the phenomena. We have ways of explaining how we know what we know. For example, there is this thing here called a book. We know this book has a certain amount of weight and mass to it, right? And I know if I drop this book, something will happen to this book. It will fall down. Why do we know that this book will fall down? what did Newton teach us about why this book will fall down? There's a force acting on this book called gravity. Right. Is gravity actually happening on this book? No, it's not. There's a force acting on this book, and we call that thing gravity. He begins to peel apart what we understand is about what happens in the world and how we talk about what happens in the world. Those are two different things. I'll give you another example. If you like basketball, or you like baseball, I guess, right? And you see a baseball pitcher pitch amazing game against batters, right? A perfect game, right? We call that a perfect game, right? Or if someone is hitting well, we say they're hitting well. Or if we say the way that the Dodgers are fielding, right? They're having an excellent defensive field game tonight. Or switch over to basketball. If you know that the Lakers or the Clippers are doing well, you say things like, their passing game is really great tonight. Their shooting game is really great tonight. Their rebounds are really great tonight. Are those true statements? Is it true that the Lakers have a good passing game? In our world, that is not true at all, right? Used to be, right? Maybe when he wrote about it was true, but not anymore. Because passing game is not a thing. It's not a thing in the world. It is a pattern of activity that we then label with a name called passing game. A pitcher that strikes out 27 batters, we call that a perfect game. Phenomenal game, right? Amazing, once-in-a-lifetime experience, right? All he did was strike out 27 batters, but we call it this other thing. The experience of a perfect game, the experience of a good passing game, we leave that experience, we step back from it, and we label it something. Just like we label what happens to this book gravity because we understand, we can even measure it, we understand, we can verify it, but we call it this thing called gravity. Why is that important? Because for Neil Gilman, to understand anything about God is to understand that the word God is a label. That God is a label that names a pattern of activity. He likes to put it this way, and we'll get into the text in a minute. He likes to use the word myth. Myth. When you think of myths, what do you think of? Just shout it out. What do you think of? Stories, right? Greek stories about multi-headed demons, right? And heroes who are superhuman strength with big swords, right? Myths, right? How about George Washington and the apple tree or cherry tree? I even got that one wrong, right? Right? That's a myth, right? How about the shot heard around the world? Let's talk about another myth. Well, the story of a drunken rebel soldier coming out of the bar in Concord, Massachusetts, and accidentally firing off his rifle in front of the redcoats who were mustering there to put down the rebels' riot that was happening. And then they responded by forming an infantry line and shooting into the rebels, which began the Revolutionary War. That's a myth, right? That's a myth. So he wants to say, though, that we call those things myths, but the word myth doesn't come to describe only fantastical stories. It's easy to label things as myths, but myths come to explain everything about how we experience the world. Right? You're looking at me, right? I'm 5'11", 200 pounds. I have a little beard, right? Can you see my ego? No. Can you see it? No. Can you see my love? No. They both exist, some more fragile than others. Those are ideas that we begin to sever are the experience of a thing from how we talk about a thing, and that is where the word myth comes in. Let's take a look here at some of his text We're not going to be able to approach this in a very linear and logical way. We have to begin to understand about symbolic thinking and how we look at the world, okay? So if you have these pages here, and you look at page, in big numbers, it says page 399. Does everybody see that? Okay, let's read a little bit. Symbols of God are usually embedded in complex myths. Sometimes myths appear in narrative form, such as the creation story in Genesis or Exodus saga. Sometimes they are more discursive form, as in Maimonides' Guide for Perplexed or Buber's I and Thou. Like symbols, myths can have a primary theological or a religious function. Theological myths serve to create conceptual patterns of meaning. Religious myths serve to animate the life experience of a believing community. If we really understand that George Washington chopped down that cherry tree and then refused to lie to his father or mother about it, right? What is that telling us about the character of George Washington? He's honest, right? And what is that supposed to teach, let's say, our children about the founder of our country and how Americans are supposed to be? We're supposed to be honest, right? So he's saying religious myths can form in this narrative form or in a more discursive form, but they're supposed to create a context for how we live. If you understood the stories of Odysseus to understand them as stories to teach Greeks of how to be Greek, and you understand then, let's say, the Torah to teach Jews how to be Jewish, they're all myths. But that's not enough to describe what a myth is. Okay? He says, no term in the study of religions has suffered more from confusion and misunderstanding than the term myth. The confusion stems primarily from two factors. First, in popular parlance, the term myth usually is a synonym for fiction, in contradistinction to reality or facts. A magazine article with the 1987 congressional Iran Gate hearings entitled The Myth of the Reagan Debacle listed 10 myths as to the effect of the episode on Ronald Reagan's presidency, and in each case contrasts the myth with the author's perception of the corresponding reality. The unambiguous message was that each of these myths was false or fictitious, sometimes even deliberately so. In other words, a myth is a lie. How many of you have heard the term myth used this way? Myth versus truth, or myth versus fact, right? They're usually described as misconceptions or fictions or things which are untrue, as opposed to some greater truth, which if you only knew the 10 true things, you would be able to do whatever it is that author wanted you to do. Defend the state of Israel, learn how to be a better parent, know that, how to be more successful with your investments, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? That's how the word myth is popularly understood. We've applied that term myth then backwards onto these ancient stories to say then there is no truth in them. They are, in fact, misconceptions about the way the world is. And it's easy to do that. It's easy to look at the stories of Homer, to Virgil, to look at the stories of the Torah, to look at the orations of Cicero or Maimonides, to look at Aristotle, or even to look at modern philosophy or modern religious stories and say that they are simply myth. They are misconceptions by naive people. He says that's not the only way to understand the word myth. This popular distortion, he says, is compounded by a generalized scholarly disagreement on the precise technical definition of the term myth. It is used in a wide variety of scholarly disciplines, the social scientists, literary criticism, for study of religions and the philosophies of science, for example. And each of these disciplines imposes its own constructions on the use of the term. We are left then with a bewildering variety of interpretations, and it is frequently not at all clear which ones apply to our issues. In fact, in the course of teaching this material, this author has isolated some 15 possible scholarly definitions of the term myth. Some of these apply specifically to our discussion here. So, when we understand myth as a misconception, as a fantasy, and we apply it then to religion, it's easy to throw religion away because myths are a way of saying it's written by naive people. If all we knew, if we understood that the word myth comes to describe the four humors that sort of take over a person's body, which is all from Aristotelian medical writings, and then that's come to get thrown away with the rise of new medical science, and now we only understand the facts of how a body works, then what was before were these mythological humors, and what we have now is hard facts and hard science. The term myth then has come to take on a sour taste in our mouths. And he says myths like this take on various different veilings. There's myths about beginnings, myths about community, myths about what it means to be human. Basically, it's understanding master stories. Okay? Now he goes on to say, if you skip over to the next page, because I don't want to go word for word through this, he says in that second paragraph on the other side over here, myths of this kind, especially in their cosmological form, frequently invoke the activity of supernatural beings and their encounters with human beings. When they do, they acquire a religious or theological function. Things are the way they are in the world because of the activity of God or the gods, either on his or their own initiative, or in reaction to the behavior of some primordial human beings. He goes on, sometimes myths are elaborated in discursive form. Rather than a narrative how things came to be, they simply articulate or describe the underlying structure or order that pervades all things. They then become ways of structuring our experience of the world. Scientific theories are frequently mythic in this sense. Freudian psychoanalytic theory, for example, structures human behavior so that we can discriminate between the normal and the pathological, and within the latter, between various forms of pathology. Quantum mechanics does the same for the behavior of matter on the subatomic level, and astronomy for that of galaxies. Myths of this kind of function, like a pair of spectacles, they enable us to see the patterns and, sorry about the awkward staple here, structures, now on page 400, the big 400, that might otherwise escape us. They organize our experience into meaningful wholes. How does he begin to expand what the word myth means? He says myths, not just in their narrative forms, but in their discursive forms, myths come to explain everything we know about the world. The word myth isn't limited to fantastical stories from a long ago. Myths are about how we understand the world we live in. It's how we label our experiences. So if you're a quantum mechanic and you want to explain how things work on a subatomic level, there are only certain levels of experiments that you can do, and then at some point you jump off the page and you begin to speculate through a myth-making process through mathematics, to explain how things work on the quantum level. If you're a psychoanalysis, you listen to someone's experience and you begin to unravel who they are, and then you begin to label those things as particular types of orders or disorders given a communal understanding of that experience, and you label that in various different ways. Myth is not a question of truth or false, because we are all makers of myth. The question is myth or no myth. The question is which myth. Let me give you two myths. We are all created from dust and ashes. We are imbued by our Creator with a religious spirit breathed in us in the first human being, animated by God, and then brought into existence to reach toward the stars and heavens. That's one myth. Another myth. We are mixed between sperm and egg. We gestate inside of a woman's body. We come out of a woman's body, and we grow up to be biological human beings. Now, you could just say that the first myth is not factually true, and the second myth is factually true. but they are both true in the sense that they describe our understanding of the human experience. That each one of us is animated with an idea of transcendence. That each one of us tries to live beyond the mere biology of who we are. That is truth in the same way of understanding that each one of us was born into the world and are a mixture of neurons and amino acids, and yet we still strive for something greater than ourselves. The story might be different, but they both end in the same place of truth about the human experience. That doesn't mean that one is better or worse than the other, and it doesn't mean that they are correlative, that they are of the equal weight in how we understand our world. What it does mean is that they both come to explain the same phenomenon. And sometimes myths, when we live inside those myths, we understand who we are, and sometimes we jump outside of those myths and we have a different understanding. Let me give you another myth. This country was founded by a group of men who believed that in order to be more perfect, all people, all men should be created equal and just, and the government should be for the people, by the people. That's the myth. Each one of us we have an inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's a myth. Now, if we choose to live inside that myth, we feel then we are entitled, because of those secured in those myths, to live our lives in a certain way. And then we try to hold our country's institutions up to that myth and say, are we living out the promise of this country through that myth? Often, as you'll see, like tonight, politicians running for president will invoke that myth and then compare that myth to the reality in which they have, usually for their own progress, their own ability to gain power, to say, we're not living up to that myth. The purpose of government is whatever they say it is, and that is what our founders included when they believed in the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's a myth, because it tells the story of our country, what we're supposed to be, and who we're supposed to be, and how we're supposed to be. Now let's apply that to religion. We can live inside the myth and say God created the world in 7 days. We can believe that we were slaves in Egypt and God took us out of Egypt on the first of Nisan. We can believe that there were 10 plagues. We can believe that we built little huts called Sukkot in the desert. We can believe that there was a high priest named Aaron who sacrificed animals in this beautiful tabernacle. We can believe that Moses hit the rock and water came out of the rock. We can believe that Elijah came and helped resurrect the dead. We can believe that Isaiah preached what he preached to adjure the people to be better. We can believe in the exile, and we can believe in the return from the exile. We can believe all of those things. We can live inside those stories because those are myths. But what happens when you ask the question, why does one part of the Bible say God is one way and one part of the Bible say God is the other way? Why is it that we already understand this as a community, that we understand that maybe God didn't write the Bible word for word as given to us in those scrolls in the ark behind me? What then? And finally, we ask the question which is always on our minds in this day and age, is if God is supposed to be good to good people and bad to bad people, then why do I see suffering everywhere? Where was God in the Holocaust? How do we understand that people who are good and just do not get what they deserve, and people who are slimy and despicable seem to get more than they deserve? At some point, the myth, this old myth, begins to crack, and it begins to break. And for Gilman, he readily accepts this. This is why his book is called the Sacred Fragments. Because in the Torah, when Moses casts the tablets, the original tablets, to the ground, they shattered into fragments. And the question is, what do you do with those fragments? Do you throw them away? Do you grind them up and make them into something else? No, according to the Torah, they gathered the fragments together, they placed them in the ark next to the second set of tablets. So what do we do when the myth is fractured? What do we do when the myth seems broken? When we can no longer live inside the myth? Rabbi Schulweiss's explanation was then to change the religion to match our new myth. And you'll hear more about that as we go through the series this fall and this winter. That in order for Judaism to survive, we have to change the myth and reinterpret the myth in our image. Rabbi Gilman wasn't quite ready to go there. He said, you have to adopt what he calls a second naivete. He took this from a man named Paul Tillich. And he says, when the myth is broken, that doesn't mean that you should just throw it away. It means that you have to find a way, and it's not so hard to do, to find which parts of the tradition speak to you at particular moments, and you don't have to be systemic in how we understand God and the tradition, and we don't have to be uniform at every moment, understanding God in the same way. So, for example, I can stand here and lecture tonight, and I can teach you all about the historicity of the writing of the Torah and the Talmud. I can do that. I can give a very long lecture about the history of how the Torah came together and how the Talmud came together. And then I can go in tomorrow morning and put my talit and tefillin on and daven as if what I lectured the previous night was only an intellectual exercise, and yet when I'm still inside the room, inside the Beit Tefillah, when we're davening Shachri tomorrow morning, I can pray as if God is speaking directly to me. And I can do that because at one moment I'm living in one myth, and in a second moment I'm living in another myth. Because prose and poetry are part of the human experience. Because we don't just need one or the other. So when he comes to say then, well, what then is God for him? He takes Maimonides' view. If you flip to the back here, I'll show you right in the Maimonides text. Go to this page with the boxes on it. Everyone see the page with the boxes on it? Gilman loved this text. In fact, when we were sitting together one night after school was over, we were talking, he asked me to open this text and read it to him in the Hebrew. And so I opened the Tanakh I had on with me, and I opened this text to Exodus here at the top, and I was reading it in Hebrew, and he says, okay, so what does it say? And I just read it again. I said it says exactly what it says, which I'll get to in a minute. He says, no, it doesn't say anything. You see, a book doesn't speak. It says what you want it to say. It says what you're willing to make it say, because your experience with the book is part of your myth-making process. So let me show you what he does with this. In Exodus it says, and the Lord said to Moses, I will also do this thing, and that you have asked, for you have truly gained my favor, and I have singled you out by name. He said, oh, leave me, behold your presence. Moses wants to know who God is. It's the primary question of every theologian. Let me see your presence. And God answered, I'll make my goodness pass before you. I will proclaim before you the name of the Lord, and the grace that I grant, and the compassion that I show. But he said, you cannot see my face, for a man may not see my face and live. And the Lord said, see, there is a place near me. Station yourself on that rock, and my presence passes by. I will put you in the cleft of the rock and shield you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will take my hand away, and you will see my back, but my face must not be seen. So the first thing is we see this, that God asks Moses, or Moses asks God, I just want to know who you are. It's the theological question. Don't give me all this fireworks and smoke from Mount Sinai. Don't give me all of the splitting of the sea. Come on already. Let me just know who you are, face to face. And God says, no. God says, nobody can see my face and live. And he puts Moses up on the rock, and he passes by, and Moses can only see God's, as it says here, goodness. Goodness. My goodness, my tov, can pass before you. This is a very theological text, especially for someone like Rabbi Gilman. The experience of knowing God is not something we can experience face to face. You don't know when you are experiencing God in the minute that you're experiencing God. All you can experience is a pattern of activity. And then it's up to us to label that pattern God or not God. Now, there's an ethical piece in there when it says, my goodness, right? That Moses can only see God's goodness pass by. Right? So what's the implication then? God cannot be known directly. We can't even say much about God, and we'll get into that in a second in Maimonides. What we do is we make up metaphors for God, make up myths about God. Because again, myths is how we label the patterns of activity that we see in the world. Okay, so the next question is, how do we know that something is God and not something else? How do we know that the contours of life take us in a quote-unquote godly direction as opposed to maybe a direction of addiction or evil? Right? That's a very good question to ask Gilman. Gilman then says, we don't know. This is where we lean on our community to make agreements about what is good and not good. Here, take a look at the next text. Rabbi Abba bar Memel said, God spoke to Moses, my name you wish to know? It is only in accordance with my actions that I am called. Sometimes I'm called El Shaddai, sometimes I'm called Tzivaot, sometimes I'm called Elohim, and sometimes Yod-Heh Vav-Heh. When I judge all of creation, I'm called Elohim. When I wage with evil, I am called Tzivaot. And when I suspend the sins of humanity, I am called El Shaddai. And when I shed my compassion on the world, I am called Yod-Heh Vav-Heh, or Adonai, because the name Adonai is only affiliated with the attribute of compassion, as it says, Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum V'Chanun. Adonai, Adonai, God of compassion and grace. This constitutes the meaning of Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. I will be that I will be. That is, I am called according to my actions. In the Midrash, the rabbis take this idea of myth-making to the next level. There are 70 different names for God. And that these 70 different names, if you understand it from Gilman's perspective, are not names that God gave God's self. They are names we apply to things that we think are godly. Whether it has to do with judgment or compassion, looking for goodness in the world, waging with evil. Each one of these has a name. So when we call God Avinu Malkeinu, it's not because we actually believe that God is Avinu Malkeinu. We are bringing to the surface the idea, the pattern of activity that paternity and kingship can mean for us. What Gilman would then say is, if that doesn't work for you, come up with your own metaphors. Come up with your own names. So if Avinu Malkeinu doesn't speak to you because you think the word paternity invokes an abusive father in your life, then don't ever say that prayer. Or change the names. Because again, the point is not myth or no myth. The question is which myth? Which God picture works for us? He has a lesson he gives every year at the seminary where he makes his students write their own metaphors for God. God is a dance partner. God is a taxi driver. God as a lumberjack. Some things someone once wrote. And the reason why is then you come to explain your relationship with the pattern of the universe in which you relate to this sort of whooshing up of who you are and the experience of holiness in your life, and you create your own metaphor. He wants to liberate us from just using the 70 metaphors that we have in the Torah for the name of God, and maybe to come up with a few more. Here, Moses Maimonides in the Foundation in Yesodei HaTorah, I think even Rabbi Feinstein taught this text a few weeks ago, says the same thing. He says down at the bottom, Moses, our teacher, himself saw him, meaning God, at the Red Sea as a mighty man waging war. It says, Ish Milchama, there in the Song of the Sea. And at Sinai as a congregational leader wrapped in his talit, all indicating that in reality he is no form or figure, meaning God is no form or figure. These only appeared in a prophetic vision. But God's essence as it really is, the human mind does not understand and is incapable of grasping or investigating. This being so, the expressions in the Torah and the books of the prophets already mentioned and others similar to these are of then metaphorical and rhetorical. As for example, and here he doesn't use pictures, he uses ideas. He that sits in the heavens shall laugh. God on a seat up in heaven laughing? That's not factual. That's metaphorical. They have provoked me to anger with their vanities. God doesn't get angry. God can't get angry. That's not in God's view. That is a metaphor for our indignation at people's vanity. As the Lord rejoiced, God doesn't rejoice. That is the highest level of joy that we know, that we then create a metaphor for that experience and say that is somehow is godly, etc. To all these phrases applies the saying, Torah speaks in the language of men, Torah is written in the language of human beings. That is to say that the purpose of the Torah is to teach us about who we are and our experience of grappling with the divine, and it's written in language we can understand. Remember Rabbi Feinstein's lecture about Maimonides a while ago saying, we can't understand God. The best thing we can come up with is looking at God's presence passing by us and labeling that God, that the experience of the divine, of the sacred in our lives, and labeling that God, we call that a myth or we call that a metaphor. And that is on the same level of understanding of the experience of when I drop this book, we call that gravity. And they're the same level of experience because we can verify that this is gravity, and we can verify that when I hold my baby and she's cooing and I feel there's something special about that moment, that it's not simply biological. That meaning in the world isn't simply biological. It is something more powerful than that. It is something more sacred than that. It's why I care about my children more than I care about getting to the bottom of a bottle of whiskey. Because one is right and one is wrong. I know what that is already. And then I call that experience of holding my children, of seeing them, of being and seeing a sunset even, of seeing amazing things happen. I call that sacred experiences. I label that pattern of activity that completes the pattern of my understanding of what it means to be a human being beyond the mere physical. I call that God. That is what Gilman's gift is to the Jewish people, is to understand it that way. Now, if you understand that, then you can take a Torah which was written by human beings and which might not have ever been dictated by God, and you take a rabbinic tradition which was written by human beings and certainly never written by God, and you understand that these are generations upon generations of human beings grappling with the same question, which is, how do I explain the sacred in my life? What is the origin of who I am and how I should be in the world? And science comes to answer the same questions. And religion and science are great partners, not great adversaries. Here, read what Gilman wrote here, okay? He says, the challenge then, do we invent God? Do we invent God as just this category? He says, no. We discover God and invent the metaphors and the myths. Which comes first is not clear. Sometimes metaphors are revelatory themselves. They enable us to see and identify what we might otherwise ignore. But our metaphors originate in experiences that I claim are vertical, meaning they can be verified, and the experiences and the metaphors that are then refined by later experiences. These refined metaphors, in turn, illuminate new experiences, and the process continues. If the word ish milchama, God being a warrior fighter, doesn't resonate with you, that's okay. But if you've ever fought cancer and felt like the will to live, to overcome this adversary who's eating your body, maybe invoking that name of God is the right name for you. If you're a mother or a grandmother, and understanding God as El-Kana, as the jealous one, doesn't work anymore, that God picture doesn't work anymore, throw it away and take up the idea of God as Rahmana, as compassion, the womb of the world. And let that fill you up, because that describes your sacred experience. So he says the tension then is between my subjectivism and objectivism of religious claims. This is the greatest challenge to Gilman's thought, which is, how do you know, Mr. Canadian pipe-smoking philosopher, that your experience is any more real than my experience, Mr. steak-eating, Cowboys-loving Texan? Right? How do you know that? And the answer is, he doesn't know. My conviction is that we can never escape our humanness, the subjective interpretation of structure that we bring to all of our experiences. Without these structures, we would experience nothing of significance. He says, without structure, without the category of the sacred, and understanding it through the ideas of myth, nothing in the world would be significant to us. And we see what happens when nothing is significant. What's a world look like when nothing is significant to anyone anymore? It's Syria, ISIS. By the way, we have a description of that right in the Tanakh. It says in the book of Judges several times over, the people did what was right in their eyes. And they didn't have a king. It was a political understanding, but it was also that each person did exactly whatever they wanted in the very moment that they did it, and they had no regard for other people. And what happened in the book of Judges? What happened to our people in the book of Judges? We tore ourselves apart until Samuel came along and helped us find a king. Because it was the idea of the sacred that keep us together. That's why I make an argument for synagogues all the time. There is no place in the world, in the Jewish community, that raises up the idea of the sacred more than being in a synagogue and being a member of a synagogue. It's where we identify what is sacred. It's where we raise up babies. It's where we celebrate weddings. It's where we celebrate B'nai Mitzvah, those sacred moments of transition. It's where we learn profound things. It's where we cherish each other. It's where we push each other to be better. That's what a synagogue is. It is retail Judaism. But more than that, it is retail sacred making myth. That's what we do here. And we need it. Human beings need it. Otherwise, the most important thing in your life is either going to be a presidential debate or the World Series. And then when you find out whether or not the Mets won or the Royals won, what do you do? What's the very next thing you do? You turn the channel and you start watching something else. The category of the sacred is much more powerful than that if you wrap it up with these ideas of God and these ideas of sacred ancient community. They're more enduring. They create a more meaningful life. They're not just about people trying to get you to buy stuff. They're about being with each other, cherishing each other. We can't escape our humanness, he says, but without the myths, without creating structure of our experiences, nothing would be significant. It's true, we have no sense of what objective reality actually looks like, independent of our interpretive structures. But I am also convinced that this inherent subjectivism does not doom all of our theological claims to being purely human. The risk of saying anything is godly, of course, is that you might be wrong. We might be wrong. But we have a collective pattern of activity, of our people striving for freedom, of learning together, of experiencing each other at the highest levels, of showing the highest highs and the lowest lows of what it means to love and to despair. And we have a whole cycle of holidays that do that. Because what Judaism does very well, and what religion does excellently in its best cases, is describe the best parts of human experience beyond the simply physical or biological. And human beings need that. That is a true thing. That is a phenomenon of reality that is real as gravity. And if that is as real as gravity, then God is as real as gravity. Because it is a pattern of existence. And we label that thing God. That's the hardest concept to understand about Gilman. Now, there are hundreds of implications about that. I'm going to read one out of this last and final book called The Death of Death, which is about how do you understand the most thing that's the most nebulous to each one of us, which is our own mortality. How do you understand death? Because death is you can explain death simply biologically, but how do you understand death in this other mythical level? And he goes through this book, by the way, and he goes through every myth of death that Judaism has. Afterlife, no afterlife, where you go in your afterlife, resurrection, bodily resurrection, spiritual resurrection. He goes through all of those and he breaks them all down. And he says in the end, there has been no satisfactory resolution of that issue throughout meaning of death, throughout the history of philosophy. But it remains clear that what precipitates the issue in the first place is the intuition that we function in these two distinctive ways, and somehow or other, each affects the other. When I affirm that I am not only my body, I affirm that apart from my sense of my bodily existence, I am also aware of a dimension of myself which eludes identification with my bodily functions, but which remains an intrinsic to my identity as is my body. In what sense is the soul immortal? For me, not in a Platonic sense, not in a distinct entity which survives my death and the burial of my body. If I am a psycho or physical entity, then when I die, all of me dies, my body together with my inner life. The notion that the soul enjoys an intrinsic immortality denied to my body is also troubling because it takes God out of the eschatological picture. If the soul is intrinsically mortal, then God has nothing to do with my soul at the end of days other than reuniting it with my body. But the whole point of Jewish thinking on the afterlife is that it affirms God's ultimate power, the final manifestation of God's unfettered sovereignty. The doctrine of bodily resurrection then preserves this affirmation. The doctrine of the intrinsic immortality of the soul does not. When the Gevurot benediction affirms Michaye HaMetim, that God revives the dead, I believe that it means the entire scenario. God gives new life to the dead, to the totality of me, to my body together with my soul. It's very interesting for someone so progressive to really believe in resurrection this way. He says, though, I insist that my resurrection must affect all of me in my concrete individuality because I understand the central thrust of the doctrine of the afterlife as establishing the everlasting preciousness to the God of the life I led here on earth. I live that life as a concrete individual, a doctrine of the afterlife that has my soul merging into some cosmic soul after my death would defeat the entire purpose of the myth. And again, he says, and he concludes here, he says, I am also a product of modernity, a child of the Enlightenment. I pride myself on being a rational being and on using my critical faculties and on appreciating the value of the scientific method. That part of me makes it difficult to ignore the raised eyebrows, the charges of denial, of wishful or mushy thinking, of lacking the courage to confront my death with equanimity and to confront me whenever I speak of my hope for a hereafter. I acknowledge my vulnerability to those criticisms because I can identify with them, because I see them within myself I understand where they come from. But at those moments, I cling by my very fingernails to the realization that my rational self is not the whole of me, that there are dimensions of my experience that elude the critical temper, that would remain for me a realm of enchantment. I do science, but I also appreciate poetry. But also I like to play. I then seize that tiny window of opportunity, that sliver of openness that takes me beyond criticism to a new level of understanding. I re-enchant myself to the world, or to use the term which I referred to earlier, I enter the second stage of the willed or second naivete. My second naivete takes me in and through criticism. It does not ignore, deny, or sidestep my critical faculties. It acknowledges their legitimacy, even their power, and it takes me beyond their reach. It is what makes it possible for me to hope that my life here on earth is not my entire destiny. That kind of hope takes me beyond the conclusions of my rational self. It refuses to surrender to the charges of the denial and wishful thinking. It comes from some other dimension of my being, from the intuitive sense that I form a part of a broader order of existence that lends my life coherence. Or to use another terminology, I then reclaim my myth, precisely as myth, broken perhaps, but still very much alive, and I revel in its power. And at that moment, I recite the Giverot benediction of the Amidah and praise the goodness and the majesty of God who gives life to the dead. What Gilman is saying here, and this is the very last thing he ever wrote, was at the end of his own life, he refuses to allow himself to just fall into a rationalistic understanding that his death is an entire death. He's willing to put himself into this place of reclaiming the myth because he knows he's not only a rational, scientific human being, and he wants to live in the world of poetry. He wants to live through the end of his life in a world that plays, not just a world of prose, but a world of delight and enchantment. And that while people might think that's mushy or wishy-washy, he recognizes all of that and still makes the choice to see the end of his life as a sacred thing. And so I'd like to conclude by, again, reaffirming the central point of his thesis. Each one of us makes myths of who we are, whether it's a self-image of how we see ourselves in the world, or the image of what our country expects of us and who we are given our country, or what our family expects of us and what even the word family means, or what science is trying to teach us, what we learn through science, has come to explain the world. But he says beyond the physical, beyond the biological, even beyond the psychoanalytic, there is a whole other aspect to ourselves, this other category, this pattern of existence that exists at the lowest and at the highest levels. And that only way of understanding that is using the same tools that we use to understand everything else, by making metaphor or by using myth. And that the sacred part of our lives, the most important intrinsic goodness in our lives, he labels that myth by using the big G-O-D. He labels that God. And that the stories we've told, the Torah that we have, is a myth. And it can be broken. And it can be shattered. But it's our job as myth makers to pick up those sacred pieces, put them in the ark, and carry on. And continue to make myths, adding to the story, adding to the beauty of our religion and our people, and understanding that it's okay to say the words even if you don't believe them when you're in services, because when you're in services, you're at play. You're not living in prose. But you're living inside the myth and not outside the myth. And that at one moment you might be a rationalist, and another moment you might be a poet, and another moment you might be a prophet, and another moment you might be a scientist. But that's okay because they're all in partnership to explain the world in which we live. With that, I'm going to conclude my formal remarks, and I'm happy to take a few questions. Elon, sorry.
So
I will repeat the question. Don't worry.
So when myths conflict, my myth essentially impacts your world, and your myth impacts my world on a community basis. You have the Israeli-Palestinian problem. How do you deal with conflicting myths?
Great question. His question is, okay, it all works for one person. It might even work for a small group of people, but what happens when your myth is diametrically opposed to my myth? Give the example of the current political situation between Israelis and Palestinians who are operating out of very different myths. Gilman would say this. He would say, both myths have truth. There is the myth of the Sabra, and there's the myth of the Nakba, and both of them are held truth. And that what we need to do more than anything is to listen to each other's myth, find the truths in those myths, and find how we can live together through those myths. That is what Gilman would say, is that you listen to your truth, you listen to my truth, and that we have to thresh them against each other. And we have to not necessarily have a synthesis, but we have to have coexistence. That's what he would say. We don't have to merge them into a singular story, because singular stories might not be the best way of explaining our reality. So I don't want to talk about my views or anyone else's particular views of what's happening in Israel right now. I just want to talk about this on a philosophical level. Dov.
Rabbi, when is an accepted belief a metaphor, and when is it a myth? A myth.
Myths and metaphors are virtually interchangeable, so let me just stay with that. A metaphor is in literature, a metaphor comes to explain something which you don't quite have the words to explain, like a rosy-fingered dawn. Rosy-fingered dawn comes to explain the sun rising with some clouds in the air, and you see the redness creeping over the horizon over these beautiful clouds. That's what a rosy-fingered dawn is. But what rosy-fingered dawn also comes to explain is the beauty of dawn, right? The beauty of... And using the word rose, for example, rose is a symbol, it's also a metaphor for love, right? Why is it a metaphor for love? It's a metaphor for love because it's beautiful. The flower is a sex organ, so there is the sexual component. It is sweet, it is ephemeral, and it has thorns. All of those things make us understand the intensity of our experience. That's why rose is a good symbol, a good metaphor for love, because it comes to explain much of what our understanding about human experience of love actually is.
And what happens when your personal myth is contradictory to what the group's myth?
Right. So again, when the myths collide with each other, one of three things happens: either they break, or you break, or you find a way of coexistence with separate myths coming to explain the same experience. And that's okay. And God is a baker. That's your metaphor. That's great. I believe it. I believe your God is a baker. Ron.
Yeah. You compare myths to scientific propositions. And scientific propositions have a certain amount of proof to them. They begin with an assumption that you can measure something, and by going to a certain conclusion, you get what you call the truth or the law. Okay. Now you
don't get truth, you get fact. Just be clear about that. You have correspondence theory of truth. You believe something, you test it out, and if it matches the thing you believe, it becomes true. That's the correspondence theory of truth. Most science is based on the correspondence theory of truth.
I have the same problem as this lady in the back, that my myth is good, and I believe there is truth in that. I can't prove it, but there is truth. Good does not involve decapitating people. That's somebody else's myth, and that can't be true. And that's my problem with this.
Well, it's not. So he says it's hard to get out of the subjectivism of the relativity of the entire understanding. So then what he tries to then say is that when you're understanding ethics, because I've had this conversation with him, I don't know how many times, about the relativity of it, is if you believe in strong relativism, then you're actually not believing in anything, right? If everything is of equal weight, then you're actually not believing in anything at all. And he says, well, you have to take the myth on the strength of its merits and what its ability to push life forward. And so he would argue from his subjective position that his myth is good and the myth of, let's say, ISIS is bad. And that it's our job to push a good myth forward, and it's ISIS's job to recede because our myth is ultimately stronger than their myth. And he says that we believe in the truth of our myth because we believe in the truth of goodness, of human dignity, of love, of justice. But those things are all metaphors for an experience that we agree to correspond to what our idea of truth is. In the same way that science is an idea, you have a correspondence theory of truth. And that we have to then push forward. We have a responsibility. Here's where Rabbi Schulweis and Rabbi Gilman actually are very close to each other, is they both believe that living inside of these processes, we have a responsibility. It's not God's job to bring goodness in the world. That's our job. But our job is to identify that goodness with the category of the sacred, which both Schulweis and Gilman do. It's just that Schulweis isn't willing to, in some of his works he is, but really, generally speaking, isn't willing to put this category of goodness, this godliness, out in the world. Schulweis wants to tether it to each one of us as like it's inside of us. Like each one of us has a godly, almost like a godly organ that sort of exudes goodness. And Gilman wants to say, well, actually, no, it's a pattern of existence across an entire culture, history, myth, and that pattern of existence that we label as goodness, that's the goodness. That's what God is. That's a major difference between the two of them. Okay, just a couple more questions.
Over here, sir.
Over in the back and then over here, yeah.
Your wonderful presentation has strained our limits to understand. How then do you go ahead with your views and teach them to children? Where do you begin?
I begin with the metaphor piece, right? Rabbi Schulweis does the same thing. He's written about this a bunch of times. You tuck your kid in at night, and they ask about God, and our first level is we teach stories. We teach all the stories. Why? Because we believe in literacy. We want our kids to be Jewishly literate. We teach about our history, right? And then when they say, where is God today? You take their hands, and you put it on your chest, and you say, can you touch my love? And the kid looks at you and says, I can't touch your love. I feel your love, but I can't touch it. I said, good, that's the first step. You can feel, but maybe not touch. And you have to use the invisible to explain the visible. That's the first step. I can go deeper, but if you talk about to children, that's where I would start. Yeah.
Rabbi, I wonder, when in history of Judaism did a substantial portion of the Jewish thinkers or rabbis depart from the concept that the Torah is the written word of God and must be accepted verbatim?
Okay, so when did we start getting away from this? The answer is with Baruch Spinoza and Moses Mendelssohn in the dawn of the modern period, when we had to try to, both of them had the auspicious challenge of dealing with Jews who lived inside of the myth, the ancient myth of what Judaism was, and dealing with advent of modernity and modern science. It's the same question we've been trying to answer for generations since the 16th century. We're trying to answer again today in many different ways, including Rabbi Artson had an example. This is Rabbi Gilman's example. Rabbi Heschel, you'll see next week, has a way of doing it. It's the same question. It all began with modernity. And Mendelssohn answered this question the best. He said there's only two things that can happen. When your myth breaks, you either fix the myth or you change the myth. Meaning, you either change your practice. So let's say it's about something you physically do. If you don't believe you should pray 3 times a day anymore, then you don't pray 3 times a day anymore, or you come up with a new reason to pray 3 times a day. You either get rid of the myth, or you fix the myth. You either change your practice, or you change the reason for why you practice. we cannot get out of Mendelssohn's framework. Gilman is in Mendelssohn's framework. Schulweis is in Mendelssohn's framework. Mendelssohn was the first. Yeah.
The topic today was God as a myth. And this gentleman brought up the first step in terms of childhood, in terms of understanding the myth of God. As a introspective person who studied theology and philosophy, what metamorphoses have you gone through in terms of your myth of God?
Great question. This will take us a while. I'll do it till you get. What has been my theological metamorphosis? It keeps changing. Every year in rabbinical school, I challenge myself to write a long, extended, annotated personal theology. And every year I try to write it from a completely different perspective to see if I could arrive at some conclusion. It was a difficult task, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. When I was a kid growing up, I had sort of the original naivete of God with a white beard in the clouds, right? I expected Elijah to come trotting down the street at night at the Passover Seder in a fiery chariot. You know, I, like many kids, believed in all these little stories, and that's okay, because that's a great place to begin. The imagination of a child is the best place to be in the universe. And then that all stuff began to fall away and break apart. And my first response was to become really frum. I ended up moving to Israel and living in the old city of Jerusalem and studying in yeshiva. But not even Ashkenazi yeshiva. I studied in Iraqi and Moroccan yeshivas because I wanted to cast off any sense of my assimilated self. So I never wore a black hat or a black coat because Sephardim never wore black hats and black coats. But I studied with old Sephardi rabbis. I davened. I lived in the old city. There's a week went by when I didn't leave the Jewish quarter. So the question is then, how did I end up at Valley Beth Shalom, Because I was going back to leaving the old city, a rabbi was giving me a ride, and we started talking about some of the religious laws about who can lead the congregation in prayer. And I asked him, he says, well, in the priests in the book of Leviticus, somebody who has been injured or has a disease or has a physical deformity can't be a priest. And the same applies to someone who can lead Shacharit bin Chamari, the 3 services we do a day. They can't be in one of those categories. So I asked, so somebody who's blind can't lead services? The answer is no. Somebody who's handicapped, who's a little person or was born genetically deformed, they can't lead? He said no. I said, what about somebody who was in the military and a limb was blown off or something? Can they lead services? Maybe, but not really. I left the car that day knowing that this wasn't for me. It was the first time. And then from there, as my myth began to change, right? Treatment of women, treatment of minorities, treatment of people with disabilities, all of these different things began to creep up for me, and I said I needed a more critical way of understanding Judaism. And I ended up leaving the yeshiva world. I ended up not wearing tzitzis anymore. I ended up leaving that world entirely, and I ended up volunteering through a Jewish social justice secular organization working in West Africa, building an elementary school by mixing concrete 5 hours a day by hand, right? And because I wanted to be part of the world, right? I wanted to help people and be part of the world. And I got a real quick education in poverty, in disease, in international development, or the lack of international development. I got an understanding in all of that real quick, and then I came back and kind of synthesized the two and ended up applying to the Jewish Theological Seminary, where I knew I wanted to do 2 things. I wanted to think deeply about God, invest myself in philosophy and theology, and I wanted to do something deep about the world, invested myself in social justice. And my rabbinate is still about those 2 things. In fact, just yesterday, our synagogue secured $300 million for affordable housing for people who can't afford to live in homes through the Board of County Supervisors. You might have read about it in the paper this morning that Supervisor Kuehl put this motion forward. It was voted on unanimously. Members of our synagogue wrote that motion. It was our team that built a relationship with the Board of Supervisors because we have a homelessness task force. We helped craft the motion, and we executed the strategy that brought us to a unanimous vote to allocate hundreds of millions of dollars for more affordable housing in LA County to end the homelessness problem that we have in LA County. And that's because we did it here. In fact, the first meeting for that was up there in the balcony seminar room. I brought in Mr. Kosher Deli for that one. So that's what my rabbinet's been about. So my current thinking is very much influenced by this, understanding that we're all myth makers, taking on Rabbi Heschel's phenomenology of the beauty of the world and wonder of the world and love of the world, taking on Rabbi Schulweiss's understanding of the infinite responsibility of human beings to be godly in the world, but still understanding that I can come here and I can study, I can go out in the world and feed the hungry, and I can still come back and put on my tallis and tefillin and open the ark and feel totally blown away by reading Torah on Saturday morning. Because it's not about myth or no myth, it's about which myth. And I refuse to live only in one of them, because I'm greater than that. I'm bigger than that. Each one of us can live with prose, and each one of us can live with poetry. And I can pray for healing of friends who are sick in shul, and I can come here and talk to you how God isn't the one who actually heals the sick, we heal each other. But I can do both, because one is prose and one is poetry, or one is poetry and one is prose. And then I can daven with all my heart, with all my soul, and with all my might on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur to atone for the sins and believe that I want to be inscribed for the book of life in the coming year. And I can sing and dance at Ne'ilah by singing Shema and saying Adonai Hu Elohim and hearing the final shofar blast and feeling it to be the most religious, impotently religious moment of my entire year. And then I can go eat bagels and schmear and care about the beginning of the football season 5 minutes later, because I can live in both worlds. And to be a modern Jew doesn't mean you have to give up on any of it. You don't have to tailor your Judaism just to your modern sensibilities of the world, and you don't have to tailor your modern sensibilities just to be Jewish. You can live simultaneously. Our heart has 4 chambers. There's room enough for all of it. And that's my current thinking about my myth. I think I'll end there. I wish all of you a lovely night, and we'll see you later.